Robert for the music. And just a short announcement before we start. Ipswich buses is unable to compete with the football traffic. And so we've had to have a slight shift round of the programme, and Stuart will be speaking after me. Thank you all for coming. Over 3 centuries ago, a congregation of Protestant dissenters met in this meeting house to celebrate the opening of this place of worship. Now, 321 years, 4 months and 21 days later, another gathering is taking place. Some here will be celebrating the reopening of their place of worship. Others here are to acknowledge the importance of the restoration of this building, not only in its preservation for years to come, but to marvel that a building of such architectural importance in this country is here in Ipswich. And some of us are here for both reasons. My name is Linda King, and my role is the chairperson of the trustees and congregation of this Unitarian meeting house. I represent all of us in welcoming every one of you here today. A special welcome to our Mayor, Elizabeth Hughes, and to her parents. Nice to see you. Our local MP, Tom Hunt, will be joining us later. A heartfelt welcome also to the representatives of the charities and organisations who supported us. And a massive welcome to the architects, surveyors, engineers, electricians, glaziers, craftsmen and women whose knowledge and skills working with the timbers, walls, windows and roof nurtured this building to what you see, or don't see, today, all of which you'll hear about later. In all houses, and this is no exception, there's housekeeping to consider. We now have a state-of-the-art fire alarm system with very good instructions from the fire service as to what we have to do and what we can't do. While we hope it will never go off, just in case it does, there are 3 exits in this building. There are the double doors over there, to my right, and there are 2 lots of doors to the front, one of which is our normal exit and entrance, and the other one is through the vestry. In the event of the alarm going off, there will be 2 people at each door, fire alarm regulations, to see you out. And when you go out, if you can congregate at the very far end towards Flower Street, please. We're filming the presentations to add to our website, but will not include anybody from the public without their permission. Before we hear from our first speaker, Stuart Edgar, our architect, I would ask you, please, to turn your phone to silent. If you turned your phone to silent before you came here, please check that you really did do it. Thank you again for coming, and we hope you enjoy this afternoon, learn a lot about the meeting house and the restoration project, as well as the refreshments and conversation outside afterwards. Now I'll hand you over to Stuart.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, I'm going to be doing 2 roles today. One talking about the architectural side, and prior to that, I'm going to put got some big shoes to fill here. Anyone who knows Phil Chatfield, who was our clerk of works through the project, he was also the surveyor before we were involved. Anyone who knows him will know there's some big shoes to fill here. So we already had the presentation set up. I'm going to do my best to run through his slides as well as my own. Okay, so prior to any works, Phil is a member of the congregation. Phil knows the building. He was employed on a professional level to undertake a survey of the building, to look at structures, and it was known that there were some previous works that were undertaken in the 1960s and 70s that were what we would consider unsympathetic repairs. So, Phil's presentation here, walking around north elevation. This is what we now consider the front of the building, although the east is actually the original entrance. We can see here horizontal and vertical cracking and a peeling off of a superficial layer. This is not a line wash, we have this tested later on. We've got some horizontal cracking here, you can see in the render. Initially this may have been shrinkage which has turned into thermal cracks. So the building is heating up in the summer and expanding and cracking because the render is tougher than it should be really. We can see some vertical cracking and some day joints that we would call them on the corners here, lightly thermal, movement again. And some cracking above the portico, above the leadwork where it's joined against the render. Moving on to the east elevation, I said the former main entrance. East elevation gets a lot of the morning sun, so it's the first to heat up. We're not a true east elevation here, so I think it's southeast. You're getting a lot more sun, the elevation's heating up a lot more, and it's really expressing those thermal joints and thermal cracks. You can see we've got cracking shown here between window joints on the lower level, which is just typical of a timber frame building, which has a hard render to it. Window frames here, we're seeing some rot damage in the junctions. Again, east elevation still here. We've got a crack that's so big that you can see the metal larding underneath it. Obviously that's going to let more water in. The more water that gets in, the more damage happens to the render. The roof, we can see this is a ridge tile used on the hip here. It's a poor previous repair that we inherited in the building. The tiles themselves were of mixed quality, we'll get to those ones shortly. West elevation. So this is where we saw even more thermal damage. The windows, however, had been more recently repaired. They were not in a bad state particularly. When we move around to the south elevation, that's where the windows were really in trouble. We can see here a crack running along the plinth line. This is where that's now concrete covered plinth joins with the render. And there's thermal separation because they're expanding at different rates. There's a timber frame behind here that wants to move, and the concrete doesn't want to move. So you get that difference, and then it forms open as a crack. And getting water coming into this position, freezing over winter, exacerbating the damage. More cracks. This is again on the east elevation, on the west elevation. Sorry, this is where we've got some of the downpipes stand on timber off stands. Now that's generally fine, but again the timber where it's exposed is getting damper, it's swelling, there's more movement there, and again it's moving and expanding at a different rate to the render. So you get cracks forming again, and the more cracks you get, the water gets in and it just exacerbates and gets worse. The roof that we can see here, we've got ridge tiles on the left hand side, which are not original, poor quality repair. On the right hand side you can see what's called an arris tile, where the tile's actually formed to work its way around the corner. The repairs that were done mid-century saw a lot of the tiles on the north elevation here entirely replaced with concrete tiles, whereas they should be a handmade clay tile here, which is what we looked to replace later on. The south elevation typically is getting more sunlight. So even when it's getting damp, it should be able to dry out quicker. That wasn't the case here. We've got lots of trees behind the building here, and it ended up being much more of a north elevation in terms of treatment. It was getting damp, the trees weren't allowing the moisture to evaporate. We have moss growing on the ground level, which you wouldn't expect from a normal north elevation, south elevation, sorry. The windows, again, just from being exposed to further damp, were in a terrible state. A lot of them were just not fit for purpose, they were rotting through. There's a lot of weight to these glazed screens, and the windows weren't really doing a sufficient job of holding them anymore. They were not original, they had 60s or 70s replacements. Poor quality timber was used, poor quality joints as well, operating at the time, and it's a recipe for disaster. The circular windows above me, we had these weep holes that had been formed from lead. The idea would have been to collect condensation from the inside and allow that to get out. That may have been needed when the building had several hundred people in it in regular use. It's not the case at the moment with the size of the congregation and the use. They're just not necessary anymore. And unfortunately, they'd allowed the water to get underneath them and then not escape. So they trapped the water underneath them, and every one of them was just rotting terribly underneath. So this is where Phil has done his inspections. He's using a penknife to prod the timber, and justifying how far it goes in is how rotted the timber is. So you can see this is a knife blade quite far, even when the frame looks like it's intact. There's a lot of rot happening underneath there just from poor quality timber. This one you have to look a little bit harder for. There's a bird's nest in the gutter, and again it's attributed to being so close to the trees, wildlife and damp getting into that space. There's some photos on the roof in a second that we'll see, stopping the drainage acting sufficiently, stopping the water getting out, and unfortunately when the water is overflowing it can be coming into the building and into the fabric. So onto the roof side. When Phil did his initial investigations here, the leaded valley was in bad condition. This is the concrete tiles that we can see. They have a lot of weight to them, they're bearing down onto that valley, and eventually they're just going to press their way through the weight of them, puncture it, and I believe there was water damage coming in on this side of the valley above the balcony. When we got involved with the project, that had already been rectified, but this is something that Phil picked up in his initial report. I believe it was the Taylor scheme that provided the grant funding for that one, thank you, Andrew. So that had already been rectified by the time we were involved with the project. Again, this is the ridge tiles that are not really suited to be sitting on these corners. You can see they've separated from the mortar. As we work our way around, again, leaf blockage happening here, so there's not enough chance for rainwater to disperse from the building, and it's causing damage. This is on the south-facing elevation of the north roof. Again, it's south-facing, it is getting lots of sunlight up there on the roof. The tiles were machine manufactured. They were laid too close together, and because they're getting a lot of sun, they're trying to expand, but they don't have movement. They're pressing against each other, it causes cracking, it causes, here we can see delamination on the surface, and once the tile starts to delaminate, water can get into it, penetrate through, it gets further frost damage, and then you get problems with leaking coming through the roof. This is on the corner where the two separate repairs have been made to the tiles, and you can see it should course all the way around the corner, so we should have a coursing of tiles running around. It doesn't happen. The tiles specified may have been the wrong size, the spacing between them has not been particularly well fitted, the actual Aris tiles on that hip corner have been bedded in a very strong cement. As I said before, this is a timber frame building, it wants to move, it will move during the thermal expansion. When you have an element such as concrete, which is too stiff and it can't move, it results in cracking. So we can see a lot of the tiles are cracked here. Again, improper fitting. Tiles have been reused several times before. Phil's report, which we do have a copy of on the table on your right hand side here, you can have a look at afterwards. Hundreds of photos in there. He spent the best part of a year, I think, so he had different seasons to go through and see the building, every element of it that he could get to. He deemed the tiles had been reused several times to the point where they were no longer fit for reuse. Normally when we're doing re-roofing projects, you'd expect there to be a good element of reuse from the tiles. You can then choose if you want to put those all on one elevation and have a truer elevation, or you can mix them in with new tiles of a good quality so that you're all sort of stippling in into the mix. Internally, however, the roof structure was really good quality. It had already been subject to some modern timbers being put in there for repair works, but structurally the roof was very sound. The felting underneath, however, was impervious, not breathable, not allowing moisture to get out. Moisture is getting in, remember, through these tiny cracks in the render, through penetrations where the roof is damaged. It can't get out. Not being able to get out through the roof is one thing. It couldn't get out through the walls either, which we'll come to shortly. The ceiling was reconstructed in the early 20th century. This is something Phil's keen to point out because it's a tidbit of information building. If you look up, you'll see what look like timber beams. They're actually false. They don't run in line with the structure. The image shows how they're constructed with timber downstands, but they're hollow. So they don't actually follow the line of structure, they're visual. This is looking at the inside of the north elevation, underneath the roof, but this is what we can see is the inside of the wall finish. What we can see in the centre picture is render that's been pushed through an expanded metal lath. This is a ribbed lath, so the black horizontals you can see is a metal, and then the material coming through is a solid render. It's a very strong substance when the two are combined, because you've got tensile strength and compressive strength combined, not allowing a lot of movement. There is no insulation, or there was no insulation, to the north elevation here. The other three elevations, however, did have some insulation. You can see a foil-backed insulation there, again completely impervious, not allowing moisture to breathe through it, not allowing water to pass through. In front of that, in places, there was a rock wall and a fiberglass insulation. Fiberglass is not particularly good. When you get wet, it holds onto the moisture, it gets damp, it soaks down, it fails to perform as an insulator. Moving internally, Phil was able to take moisture readings. I think this is the plinth behind me underneath the pulpit, and the moisture levels, in his words, were off the scale. Again, you don't expect moisture to be passing through the concrete, so this is probably condensation forming inside and ending up there. You can see the water damage and salt deposits on the bottom of the timber panelling that rests on there as well. Now, Phil had already determined, and you could see it internally, here's an example. On the south elevation and the west elevation, the main structural posts had been lost years ago, the bottoms chopped off, a plinth raised up, and where you would normally have a timber sole plate, it had been replaced. There's a photo shortly that shows some steel channels here. What we can see on the left side here, where Phil's hand is, that's the return on a steel channel supporting one of the main timber posts here. And essentially there's two steel channels either side of the main timber post, bolted through, and that had been set into concrete. At this stage, Phil was doing generally non-invasive investigations, so he didn't know what was happening underneath. That was our job later on. Some of those panels had been covered in timber, so you couldn't see the steels, but they were there. And then quickly again, this is just showing the inside of the south windows above, and where it's completely rotted through. So Phil, again, was took some samples, took some render samples. He knew that there was something not right with the material here. It wasn't moving sufficiently. It was forming these cracks where it was unable to move and heal. So he took samples, and they were sent off. The location where it's chosen to have the samples here is where there's been a crack damage, so trying to see what's happening. And we can actually see behind the two panels there's two separate laths underneath. That's the metal, expanded metal lath behind that you're pressing the render through, and they're not sufficiently tied together, and that's where the movement is being expressed. So that's where it's able to open up and moisture can get in. Other samples were also taken and sent off. This one is from the north elevation. Again, there's a difference between the laths there. And it really indicated that although the building is generally looking, or was generally looking like it's in good form, each elevation had been repaired at different stages. There were technologies going into some of these areas, particularly bad on the south and the west elevation. This is, the bottom section here is actually rusty steel channel. So that's just sitting on top of concrete. But actually where the main posts were being supported, the same steel channels were used, penetrating into concrete. It's not treated. It had been attempted to be painted afterwards, but it's untreated steel. It will oxidise, rust, and expand. This is, I think, showing the east elevation, to my right, to your left. What you can see through the gap is this is the timber sole plate exists over here. So the original construction, that's how it should be. We should have the timber on the ground, just high enough so that it's not being attacked by external moisture, but there shouldn't be any steel in here. This was some of the reports that came back from Scottish Lime Centre after Phil sent them some materials to be analysed, and it came back that the render was progressively harder on the external layers. That's the opposite to how it should be. You want it to be harder on the inner sides, and then it gradually gets softer. So the softer bit is what bears the brunt on the outside. generally if you use a line, it can dissolve itself and heal fine cracks. This was found to be cementitious, and it was not able to do that. It's not healing itself. It's impervious to water, which we can see here, water droplets sitting on the top. Okay, I'm going to hand over to myself now. I'm going to take off my field jacket, put my architect's jacket on. So we got involved with the project in 2018. KLH Architects, Ipswich based. One of my directors holds AABC, which is Architect Accredited in Building Conservation, so conservation specialists, and I'm very much under his wing in these works. This was my first major project for restoration of conservation works. So the first thing we want to do is draw the building and measure it so that we have something that we can mark up. We like drawings and sketches. We want something that we can mark up and start discussing with engineers, with people detailing, with the clerk of works. Luckily, there's a really good example of someone's, I think it was their final year work at university, who may have been local. 1939, John C. Butters, and it's at the back, on the side on the wall. He'd done a fantastic job of surveying the building, better than I could do. So we took his drawing, put it into one of our computer programs, and essentially traced it and made our own 3D model of this building. So you might think conservation architecture is traditionally fuddy-duddy and quite old still. We're utilising modern technology as much as we can in this just to benefit ourselves. It makes the drawing easier. We had a 3D model that we could take elevations from, we could start to mark up window numbers, sort of further down the line, the contractors were able to know exactly where we're talking about when we're referencing specific windows. So we identified main posts. Main posts are easy to identify because they jut into the building here, you can all see them. The intermediate timbers are not so easy to see. Because of the listing, we have timber panelling in here, which is mentioned in the listing, so it was quite well protected. We didn't want to be removing it. The majority of the works were done externally. So we knew from Phil's report already that there were these steel channels on the south and on the west elevation. We wanted to know the extent of them. Our proposal was to remove them. They were damaging to the building, and our conservation philosophy was to take out these modern interventions that could potentially put the building at risk in future. So we started to put some letterbox penetrations externally at strategic places to see what was happening with these steels. Rather than taking off all the timber panelling inside, we knew that we were going to be re-rendering the building anyway, so damage that we were making was going to be rectified. Doing it internally, it put some of the ancient and more original high significance elements at risk, so we avoided that. This is what we ended up with, some sketches to show the structure around the main post. So we have main post, timber, sat in the middle. We have two channels of steel either side. As I said earlier, they're bolted through. That steel is taking the weight of the main post, which is in turn taking the rest of the building and the roof, a lot of weight up there. The steel is then embedded, cast in situ, in place, into concrete blocks. We didn't know how far down the steels went, and at this point it didn't really matter because we were proposing everything was coming out. We didn't exactly know how, but we had to put some ideas together, and it was to be figured out later with the contractor, some of it. So this was our proposal for the restoration. So once the steel's gone, what are we putting back in its place? Well, we were proposing traditional timbers. This is a softwood timber frame, which is why it moves a lot more than it would if it was hardwood. But we ended up going with a hardwood sole plate. It means it's a little bit tougher against moisture, and it's likely to move less shrinkage. So we specified a timber sole plate going back in here. Some splice repairs, which is indicated on the drawing on the bottom. We knew some repairs would be needed to the lower sections of the main timbers, and that would give us the opportunity to have some good strong mortise and tenon joints. I'm trying not to be too technical as I go through the rest of this, but I am going to be standing over here with some samples of materials afterwards and lots of drawings, so if you want a bit more technical discussions afterwards, come and see me. I need to be quicker too. Okay, let's skip through some. The philosophy again, works were being done externally. We didn't want to do damage internally, so we had to survey all the timber panels and try to ascertain where they'd already been removed in the 60s and 70s to do the works that we were now trying to undo. The package of works we put together included repairs to windows, where some of them were original on the north elevation. The lead had become so old that the timber, the glass was sort of sagging forward and potentially at risk of falling out. So window repairs were included, re-roofing, we knew we were re-roofing the whole thing. We wanted to increase the ventilation up there as well, so we'll touch on that shortly. And we knew we were going to be doing some re-rendering decorations externally so we could see what was happening externally. Just before we got started, we were able to bring the University of Ipswich. They have an architecture department, and they're one of their members here today. We brought them here for a day. The intention was going to be that as a Historic England funded project, and Tessa's going to talk about the funding in 5 minutes, that we'd have interaction with local groups, Ipswich Society. There's lots of groups locally that would be interested to come and see this, and part of Historic England's funding means they want to try to educate people and get people involved with it, pass on to next generations as well. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Valiants were our contractors. They won the tender. They are specialists in conservation works, and they took site and started in February 2020, pre-pandemic. Immediately wanted to see the steels, so we started taking some sections out low level on the south and the west elevation so we could see the steel channels. Came up with a strategy that meant they didn't all need to be removed. We could cut some of these steels and then put a concrete capping over the top, leaving them in place, meaning we didn't have to take the whole thing out, and there was sufficient cover. That was something that was discussed with ourselves as conservation architects, with our engineers, with the contractor, with Historic England, and with the local authority conservation officer, who was really well involved. We had regular contact with her through the project. These photos were found and showed works being done in the 60s and 70s. We didn't know these existed until contractors were already involved, so they helped in the process of how the works were done. Now I'm going to quickly go through some videos that show, this was Mark, who was our site foreman. He is here today, he's coming back in. He lived and breathed this project. For the first sort of 2.5 months, this is just when COVID kicked in, he was the only person on site for a long time. He was doing a lot of these works on his own. And Les as well, contract manager, coming to give him some support. This is offering in the new oak sole plate and then dry packing underneath. So once we had the structure fairly well taken care of in these 2 elevations, we had to do some timber repairs on the rest of the building. And we hadn't seen any of this, we hadn't exposed the timber frame. We had to do it very quickly, so there was no time to draw all of this. Valiants were removing the concrete render from the surface. I was coming down to site, taking lots of photos as quick as I could, getting back to the office, stitching them together, printing them out, and coming with Richard Jackson's, who were our Jag, who was our engineer on the project, and we were going through each timber, looking at it individually. What do we need to do to this one? What do we need to do to this one? Quickly marking up to paper, back to the office, into a report, so we could get it to Historic England and to our local authority conservation officer for approval, so that we could quickly do these works. We added in this diagonal bracing to keep the building held strong together, because we were taking off a very strong substance in the concrete render. Sheet wool insulation was added between posts and between the studs. There was a concern about fire risk, so we had to build some sample panels. We took them back to our office at KLH. We put a blowtorch to them, so we could test and see how volatile it is. It's a very volatile substance if you have it open on a barbecue, for instance, which we tested as well. When it's built into a wall fabric, it actually needs so much oxygen to combust that it self-extinguishes. So we were satisfied that we were putting the right product in here. It also has a very good material of holding onto moisture when it gets down, and when it's warmer in some months, it will allow that to be released. Rather than something like a mineral wool, which doesn't hold moisture, it lets it pass through, it's permeable, but it doesn't hold on to it, it just lets it drop. Bad for our new timber sole plate. Because of flammability, we did have some increased fire detection and prevention methods. There is now a fire system, little white circles you can see just next to the lights. They are constantly drawing through air. It's an actuated fire system, and they detect smoke particles before we would smell it, I think. That's what we've done. We also compartmentalised the roof space, and these blue strips are made to compartmentalise the walls as well, so the fire can't spread. The mix that we had for our line render, so putting back something that's breathable and movable, going back to how it would be traditionally. We spoke to Scottish Lime Centre, we spoke to Cooks, who were the plasterers, specialist plasterers from Cambridge, And we spoke to Rose of Jericho, who ultimately was the supplier. So a lot of people were involved with the discussion and decision, and we ultimately went with a 1-part chalk lime putty mix. This was a 3-coat system, and I've got some photos of it being built up. We also had, on Scottish Lime Centre's recommendation, test panels built on each elevation, and they were treated, we thought, exactly the same as the render was being built up, so that we could test it. We had to have 25mm standoff battens to give a bit of an air gap behind to help the lime carbonate. And here we can see some of the timber laths. There's a riven chestnut lath which give really good grip because they're naturally torn, you get the fibres sticking out. The render is then pressed through externally, and it forms a key, a nib behind that claws onto the laths. First coat is scratched up, second coat is scratched up. The final coat is then worked on with a sponge float, so you get a nicer, smoother finish. And we were doing tests on these panels. This was fairly new to all of us actually. We were spraying a chemical on here called phenolphthalein, I think was correct. Thank you, Mark. It's an indicator. If it detects high alcohol levels, which is what the lime is based on, it goes pink. So here, not set. But it will take a year to fully cure all the way through. We just needed to know that it was gradually getting them doing its job, and that the sheet fill wasn't stopping it from curing properly. This is fill crawling into the roof space. Even though we had these test panels, sometimes it's not enough. We wanted actual samples from the building still, so this is getting some inconspicuous samples as best we could, and testing them with the spray. There you go. So you can just see just the surface. It's starting to carbonate there, and that's probably about 3 or 4 weeks, I think. And then you can see here we kept doing these tests as we were adding layers to it, and before we were doing lime wash. You don't want it to dry out too quickly, so there's a Hessian mat put on and it's sprayed with water to stop it going too quickly. Decorations, I'm going as quick as I can. Feel your eyes on me. Decorations, we wanted to be true to the original building. There were photos only as far back, not far back enough really, we didn't have old enough photos. Next door, upstairs, and I think this is open afterwards, you can go up and see some of these paintings. The paintings were older than the photos we had, so we used those to look at. And we can see here what's now called an antique gold colour was previously used on the doors. We found it inside the office as well, so we knew that that was a true colour that had been used, and as conservation architects, it was the evidence that we needed to back that colour. And the trustees were happy with the colour as well. We did put some options forward. The lime render, we lime wash finish it. We had several colours. We again had some samples built. We brought the sample panels to site, and collectively decision was made between all parties, including the Conservation Officer, the trustees, and Historic England. Again, as with the lime wash needs to be put onto a damp surface so it doesn't dry out too quickly, otherwise it's going to delaminate, flick away. So it's constantly being dampened between coats. And we had 5 coats externally here. The roof, we knew we'd taken all the tiles off, structure was good underneath. The tiles were on such a long lead-in time, we had to order them right at the start of the project, which meant we had to get these samples here immediately and get them signed off. All new battens. We have a breathable felt here, we've got samples of this again. We had a bat survey done, and although there weren't bats present, there was suitability for bats. So we had to be considerate, and we used a breathable membrane which is specialist for bats. So otherwise they get their claws trapped in the fibres and they perish. We also needed to increase the ventilation in the building, so we actually added lead bat tiles, which allow air through and bats. Window restorations, I think this is the last bit. The windows are really interesting because where the render has been replaced, you only see it for 30, 40, 50, up to 100 years. You don't see any scar of the original until you take it off. The windows, you can see original glazed panels, quarries, we call the little tiles. You can see original quarries dating back to the first use of the building. There's some scratched in with names of workers. It's a history lesson as you go through. This one's from 1900 when some major restoration works were done. There's graffiti or maker's marks all over, embedded and preserved in the glass. And we wanted to keep that, obviously. So where we had elements like this where there was rock damage to the frames, well, that's all we want to that's what we want to change. We only want to change it if it's broken. Everything else gets retained and restored. Small elements like this you could fill with putty, but generally we were doing works that required really skilled craftsmen from Valiant to do timber splice repairs, and you can see a really good example here, one of the windows behind me. Our glazier, unfortunately, was a really good glazier, but he was self-isolating because of his partner, so Valiant's had to take all the larger pieces of restoration work to him, rather than him doing them here. And here's in his workshop. We went to meet him so we could discuss potentials for glass. There wasn't a lot of glass replacement needed actually, but again we have samples that we discussed with the Conservation Officer and Historic England to make sure we're going down the right route. This is an example of some glass back in. And here is Terry doing an in-situ repair on the north elevation, actually cutting out a piece of glass. This is reused glass, so when he's on the project he'll take second-hand glass and reuse it, so it's being cut down to a smaller piece, doing that in situ. Here's a completed restoration. You can see that's new lead work, that's lead cane it's called. New putty, internally, obviously that was an old piece of glass, sorry. Internally, new copper ties tying back to our saddle bars. This is the level of detail that Valiants were having, but another contractor might not. This is prior to decoration works, and the joint was actually just scraping down the detail. There's a fine detail on the corner, and he wants to preserve that, so when it gets painted over, it's not lost. He's sharpening up that corner, so when it gets redecorated, you still read the detail. Again, really good craftsmen involved with the project. Lead work wasn't easy. Every elevation, as I said before, was treated differently through its history and through time. So they're all slightly different. The windows had been repaired at different times. We couldn't have one solution that worked for all the windows, so we had to look at them individually, and we had several different options for just the lead work over the windows. Now I've not really touched today, and I'm not going to really touch on the WC work and the external works beyond this external section here. You can see the bottom of the doors is painted white here. The external levels over time had raised by about 200 mm, about this. And it meant that the doors were, the floor level was sunken underground, 200 mm. The doors were opening inwards, so they hadn't had to be cut back. But some of the presence of the building wasn't as it was originally designed and intended. Phil did some really good work in getting funding for it. I know that Tesla was doing some fantastic funding getting the toilet funded at the same time. So these works came later, but it meant we could drop the car park level externally by 200 mm and restore the front elevation, the door heights to the proportions that they were originally designed to and they should be. And I'm now going to finish just with some sort of before and after photos that fade one into the next before handing over. So this is the east elevation, the original entrance. This is our north elevation, now used as the entrance because of the car park. And you can just about see it gets a little bit longer. And then this one is the door that really shows, if you keep your eye bottom left, you can really see where the height difference was made here. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Tessa.
I'm going to hand over to Cliff, and the buses have managed to bring him here. So, although we were starting with Cliff, we're going to invite him to carry on now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I must apologise for my late arrival, but I'm going to blame our third-rate bus service for that. Now, my brief, as I was given it, was to talk about the origins of the meeting house. Now, as a building, I could say that its origins date to the 5th of August 1699, when 6 members of the congregation signed a contract with Joseph Clark, described as a house carpenter, to build a meeting house on land purchased for £150 by Thomas Bantoft and Ipswich Mercer. One of the congregation's signatories was a beer brewer, Thomas Catchpole, and perhaps he was to provide the 4 barrels of good small beer for the workmen that are mentioned in the contract. I don't think the workmen on his restoration got any beer, but there you go. The price agreed for erecting the building was £256, 14 shillings and 6pence. The galleries were to cost a further £96, and how much the other fittings, such as the clock, the chandelier, and the magnificent pulpit, how much those cost, we don't know. But these few bare facts about the building don't really account for the origins of this Protestant dissenting, now Unitarian meeting house. And these origins lie in the religious and political turmoil of the 17th century, when rival Christian sects and denominations vied for the control and the soul of the Church of England, or should I say the Church in England. Without going into all the complexities, let's just say that the main parties were firstly the Episcopalians, or Anglicans, who wanted a national church headed by the king and run by bishops and archbishops. Ousted during the Commonwealth, these Anglicans were returned to power after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Secondly, there were the Presbyterians, who favoured a national church, but one without bishops, organised instead into presbyteries and run by presbyters. Such a system prevailed in the Church of Scotland, but the Presbyterians never achieved their goal of controlling the Church of England. And thirdly, there were the Independents, also known as Congregationalists, who rejected the idea of a unitary Church of England and instead declared that every local congregation was fully a church in its own right. Both Presbyterians and Congregationalists were rooted in Calvinist theology and in Puritanism. And Puritanism was a movement to reflected a desire to rid the church of what they saw as the impurities derived particularly from Roman Catholicism. There were other sects too, such as Baptists and Quakers, but they were more marginal and less influential at this time. During the Commonwealth period, Presbyterian and Independent ministers often occupied the pulpits of parish churches, but this wasn't to last. In 1662, the so-called Act of Uniformity re-established the old Anglican order, and those non-Anglican clergy who refused to conform, who dissented, were rejected, that is to say, they were expelled from their pulpits and became known as Protestant dissenters or nonconformists. If they continued to preach, they faced imprisonment, which is what happened to a number of these approximately 2,000 ejected clergy. Under threat of persecution, many of them continued to preach in secret and in hiding, gathering together congregations of fellow dissenters, often comprising both Presbyterians and Independents. And this is what happened in Ipswich, although we don't know exactly when. However, in 1672, a relaxation of the law allowed these congregations and their ministers to apply for a license to preach. And this is when the Ipswich dissenting congregation emerges from the shadows with their appointment of the Reverend Owen Stockton. The legal status of the dissenters remained uncertain for some years, but they were never again fully suppressed. In 1680, the Ipswich congregation still comprise of Presbyterians and Independents, and worshipping in hired premises, called a new minister to succeed Owen Stockton. This was the Reverend John Fairfax, former vicar of Barking near Needham Market. In 1686, the congregation divided, the Presbyterians and the Independents going their separate ways. The Independents later became the Congregational Church, what is now Christ Church, on Tackett Street. John Fairfax, though, continued with the Presbyterians. In 1689, the so-called Act of Toleration opened the way for dissenting congregations to build their own places of worship. The Ipswich Presbyterians, for whatever reason, waited 10 years before they did so, still worshipping in hired premises which were on Silent Street. In 1699, though, the decision to build this meeting house was made and construction began. The congregation still identified as Presbyterian at that time, and it was perhaps nearly 100 years before it had evolved theologically to become Unitarian, and it was technically illegal to be Unitarian until 1813. However, we have in our possession a copy of the sermon that John Fairfax preached at the opening of this meeting house on the 26th of April, 1700. The sermon is a justification for building this tabernacle of meeting, as Fairfax called it. And that particular copy belonged to someone who was probably present to hear it as a member of the congregation. His name was John Notcutt, who we know held Socinian, which is to say Unitarian beliefs. And that briefly is the story of how this building and the congregation which worships here originated.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you. I was, in my notes, going to say all the speakers, but Stuart has been wonderful and done the job of two. So thank you to everybody who has spoken. It's really good to hear in detail the story of our meeting house. And none of it would have been possible without the dedicated support of all the people who raised the funds to pay for it. And first, I want to mention the smaller financial contributions, which required just as much, if not more, commitment to raise the money. I'm thinking of the people who searched the corners of their cupboards to find old or broken jewellery for us to sell for scrap, or bits and bobs to recycle and sell on for donations. The people who baked cakes for fundraising events, who organised concerts, played at them, who sewed a patchwork quilt and raffled it, who ran or swam or walked or cycled in sponsored events, who gave through our Just Giving page, who talked to people and to the media to raise our profile and to appeal for donations. Without your help, without the help of the little people, if you like, we would have lost hope. So thank you. Thank you from all of us. And then we thank the bigger organisations and the trustees of the grant funders who believed in our project and the need to preserve this beautiful building for future generations so that we could invite more people from the community to make use of it. There is a list in your programme of all these grant funders who all gave what they could. I mention Historic England in particular because they generously gave us the largest grant, and Trudy Hughes, who cannot be here today, was tireless with her support and her advice, which was extra challenging during all the different lockdowns. The National Churches Trust was unable to send a representative, although on one of our early open days when we were able to open during lockdowns and had all sorts of other cautionary procedures. They did send a representative, but their chief executive, Claire Walker, has sent the following message, and I quote: "The UK's 41,000 churches, chapels and meeting houses are at the heart of communities in cities, towns and villages, and are a treasure trove of architecture, history and faith. The National Churches Trust is proud to have supported Ipswich Unitarian Meeting House with a grant of £40,000 to help fund the structural repair project. We hope that the completed works will allow your building to thrive and to remain a vital part of the community for many years to come." End quote. I also mention the Suffolk Historic Churches Trust, our local churches trust, and they deserve an individual mention because they gave their maximum grant initially, which meant that work could be done on the roof to prevent further damage. And they were then able the following year to contribute to the installation of our toilet with facilities for people with a disability and for baby change. Thank you to Andrew Gibbs, our treasurer during the project, who coped with all the extra financial work magnificently. Thank you, Andrew. I cannot mention any other individual names as I would be at risk of forgetting someone. So thank you to everybody. On your programme too, sorry I haven't finished with that though. On your programme is also a list of the companies involved in the restoration work. Using their specialist skills, they have made a mark on our history, just as the workers did when the building was first created, including those who scrawled their messages to the future on windows or wood, messages which we treasure. Now that our building is secure, it means that we can focus on the future. A Friends of the Ipswich Unitarian Meeting House group has been set up and we launch it publicly today. We invite anyone who is interested in the heritage and history of Ipswich to join us. Your public and financial support matters so that we can really use the building to its maximum potential. It's a building which is important to Unitarians, but it's also really important for the history of the town. We can now hold more events, like the music and song concert next Saturday given by the Trianon Group, and tickets will be available in the courtyard, and the Anglia Baroque concert on Saturday the 20th of November. We invite our community to use this building and our upper hall next door. We want to share it, make it a useful resource. So if you or a group you're involved in is interested in finding out more, do speak to me or another of the trustees, or contact us via our website. Maybe it's time now for us to celebrate with some bubbly. So, as Robert plays us out, I invite you to move towards the courtyard where we will be serving both alcoholic and non-alcoholic bubbly, cake and tea. Stuart, Mark and, well, sadly not Phil, together with other people involved in the restoration project, will be here to show the slides again, to talk in more detail and to answer technical questions. They will be based on the far side of the meeting house. Outside, we have a display of the photos of the work in progress beside the tables, and in the upper hall, so up the wooden stairs outside, there's a display of photos, prints and paintings of the meeting house over the years. So we thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for coming, for supporting us and for joining us in the celebration. Over to you, Robert, to play us out.